Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series. My name is Myra, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Tamara Lanier in conversation with Emiko Tamagawa. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Thank you for keeping your phones on silent during the event. There'll be time for a Q&A, so get your questions ready. This event is being live streamed. Hi, YouTube. So if you'd like to avoid being recorded, just avoid this general area of the live stream, but we'll shut it off after the event is over so you can move about the cabin freely afterwards. If you haven't yet picked up your pre-ordered book, or if you'd like to buy a book, you can do so at the register right back there in the corner after the event. Thank you for buying books with us and supporting these amazing authors and our store so we can continue to make events like this one possible. Now, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's guests. Emiko Tamagawa is a longtime producer of arts and culture segments for Here and Now. She studied psychology and drama at Yale and Brandeis and toured colleges and high schools with her one-woman show about the Japanese-American internment before turning to radio. Tamara K. Lanier is a tireless champion for truth and justice and a plaintiff in the Lanier v. Harvard reparations lawsuit. She is also a 27-year veteran of the state of Connecticut Judicial Branch, where she retired as a chief probation officer. She is the board member of Connecticut's Racial Profiling Prohibition Project, the past vice president of the New London NAACP, and an active member of the St. John's Christian Church of Groton, Connecticut. Tonight we are here to celebrate from these roots, one woman's unrelenting mission to reclaim her ancestors' history and honor their lineage pits her against one of the country's most powerful institutions, Harvard University. Tamara Lanier grew up listening to her mother's stories about her ancestors. As the Black Americans descended from enslaved people brought to America, they knew all too well how fragile the tapestry of lineage could be. As her mother's health declined, she pushed her daughter to dig into these stories. "Tell them about Papa Renti," she would say. It was her mother's last wish. Thus begins one woman's remarkable commitment to document that story. Her discovery of a 19th century daguerreotype at Harvard University's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, one of the first ever photos of enslaved people from Africa, reveals a dark-skinned man with short cropped silver hair and chiseled cheekbones. The information read Renti, Congo. All at once, Lanier knew that she was staring at her ancestor her mother told her so much about, Papa Renti. In a compelling account covering more than a decade of her own research, Lanier takes us on her quest to prove her genealogical bloodline to Papa Renti's that pits her in a legal battle against Harvard and its army of lawyers. The question is, who has claim to the stories, artifacts, and remnants of America's stained history? The institutions who acquired and housed them for generations, or the descendants who have survived? From these roots is not only a historical record of one woman's lineage, but a call to justice that fights for all of those demanding to reclaim, honor, and lay to rest the remains of mishandled lives and memories. Please welcome Tamara Lanier and Emiko Tamagawa.
Do we turn it off? And maybe it's just because they talk about your past, incorrections. I'm just curious. Did anything was anything as hard as this last 15 years struggle against Harvard?
I can honestly say no. I have worked with gang members, people convicted of murder, and my greatest challenge and my greatest fight has been with Harvard University.
That's what I figured. It sounded like that. Because they've given the sort of big general outline of your story, I just want to sort of hone in on some of your feelings. When you first found the picture of Papa Renti through a wonderful man who did research on the internet. This is back in 2010, by the way, when people didn't do lots of research on the internet still. And you saw the picture of your ancestor for the first time. Can you talk about what that was like?
It was surreal. The moment, and there's a lot of backstory to how I get to the moment where I'm sitting at my computer desk and I'm clicking an attachment that was provided to me by an ice cream shop owner, a gentleman from a small rural community in Franklin, Connecticut. he did the research and found the image of Papa Renti. And he also did the research about Louis Agassiz and the scientific racism and the ugly theory of polygenicism and all of the ugliness. He put that in an attachment and sent it to me. I opened first the information about Louis Agassiz and his history and the ugly scientific experiment that he used my ancestors, I say, as a tool to prove their own inhumanity and their own inferiority. And I read all of this ugliness, and I wasn't really sure why Rich was sending it to me. And then I opened the second picture, and the image of Papa Renti filled my screen. And it was, like I said, a surreal moment, because as soon as I saw that image, I knew that this was the man that I had heard so many stories about for my entire life. And I just started just focusing on all that I saw that was familiar, his eyes, the cheekbones. He seemed to be talking to me in a way that we were communicating, though we weren't. And it wasn't like I was losing my mind or anything, but he was communicating with me, his frustration, his anger. And I sat and I probably looked at that image for about 15 or 20 minutes and just personally reflecting on my mother, the history, my mother's brothers, who he looked so much like. And then I called my daughters to my room. I said, you gotta come see this. This is Papa Renti. And then my children started just reflecting. My youngest daughter said that, Mom, he has your eyes. My oldest daughter said, my mother, who not only told me stories from as far back as I can remember, but also told my children these same stories. My oldest daughter said something so very profound. She said that as Grandma told her these stories over and over, she created an image of Papa Renti in her mind of what he would look like, and this giant man, this giant figure. And to see him in this state, in this condition, you know, she was really taken back by that. And it kind of shattered the image of this patriarch, this giant man that she had imagined for most of her childhood. And we spent about 40 minutes just sitting and talking, and it caused us to reflect about my mom. And I remember thinking, if she had only lived a few more months, she could have seen the image of the man that she had heard so much about her entire life. And we're just, you know, I'm excited because I'm seeing this image. I'm lamenting because my mom isn't seeing it. And then all of a sudden, it hits me. The scientific racism document that I just read was about my enslaved ancestors, so now I'm angry. And I'm like, this is not this man's legacy. This is not who he is. And I wanted, in that moment, I knew I had to correct the narrative. I knew that I had to reach out to Harvard and say, you got the wrong guy. You know, this is not a symbol of Black inferiority. He has a rich oral history, and the one thing that my mom celebrated, that she loved to talk about the most, was his literacy. Papa Renti was able to get his hands on a book that's called the Blueback Speller, Noah Webster's Blueback Speller, that was circulated throughout the country to teach children to read. But the enslaved people got a hold of this book and also taught themselves to read. And Papa Renti was one of those people. And he not only taught himself to read, but he would teach others. And my mom would talk about him reading and teaching from the Bible. And so to think about this scientific experiment using him to prove Black inferiority when he was the complete opposite. And I would even wager to say, when I speak, I usually share an image of Noah Webster's book and pages from it, to see how difficult it is to take a book when you don't know how to read and teach yourself to read. It's an amazing feat. And I think the enslaved people who did that were extraordinary, as my Papa Renti was. And so my message to Harvard was, tell Renti's story. He has a rich, amazing oral history. And, you know, when Harvard would talk about the daguerreotypes, it would always be in a celebratory tone about Louis Agassiz and marginalizing the enslaved people. And as recent as 2017, when they had the conference, they referred to those enslaved people as invisible, although they knew at this point who they were and that they had an amazing rich oral history. So it was a moment, when I first saw it, I called it a roller coaster ride because there were so many emotions. I was first hit with excitement, and then again lamenting that my mom didn't see it, and then angry and protective of her because I knew if she did, it would really hurt her to her core to know how her enslaved ancestors were used.
Because the images are, I mean, for anyone who has not, I mean, we have naked people. We have, and, you know, who are made to pose for the camera. We have another ancestor of yours, Delia, female, who they had naked, and her breasts are visible. And these photos were used in an attempt to show that blacks, slaves came from a different descent than white. I mean, he had a lot of really kind of wacky theories that were perpetuated by Harvard at the time, and incidentally also helped prop up the slave trade, though Massachusetts was not a slave state.
Yes, and there's one other component to this. Again, when you put it in the context of the time, 1850s, the Fugitive Slave Act, and what was going on in the country was divided on the question of emancipation or continues with slavery. And Harvard at this time stepped into the argument or the discussion and put their thumbs on the scale, and I say for one reason, and that was financial. Because although the cotton was planted, picked, and ginned in the South, the North certainly profited equally from it, and in some cases more so. My attorney who wrote the complaint, I love this line where he quotes from, and I'm not sure who, but he said, "Cotton was the thread that held the union together." And so the people at Harvard at the time, the leadership, were all heavily invested in the Industrial Revolution and needed the cotton in the South. So there was a motivation for the scientific racism and the justification for slavery, and it was financial.
Meanwhile, here you are, and you start to realize that this is your family history, and I would say you approached Harvard in a very open-hearted fashion. That didn't go very well. The first time you wanted to see the photos as someone who says, I could be a descendant, I'd like to see this photo. That was a very cold reception.
It was.
Can you talk, I mean, you talk about how it's not like, you had to go into a special room, and they wouldn't let you, like, look underneath the frame. I mean, there's all sorts of things that they just would not let you do, and it became this sort of symbol about what happened almost every single time you approached someone from Harvard.
Yeah, it wasn't a good experience. Initially, when I first visited, I had requested to see the daguerreotypes. And ultimately, my daughter and I did visit, and we were able to see them. And I expected enthusiasm, I expected excitement, because, at this point, the other news outlets are sharing the story, and other academic institutions are just like over the moon excited about this. This is amazing. And Harvard was, I say, their response was less than lackluster. They almost were put off. And I was made to feel by asking to see them that I was inconveniencing them. And I described in the book, like I said, I was a probation officer, and I spent a lot of time in correctional facilities. The whole experience made me feel like I had just visited a correctional institute and had dealt with curt security officers and corrections officers. And I really couldn't wait to get out of there. And, you know, and just in checking myself when I leave, my daughter had the same reaction. She felt the dismissiveness of Harvard.
And what Harvard was saying, what their attitude was, especially at the beginning, was, well, you might be related, but this is all very anecdotal, and there's no way you can find proof. And there are a couple of things that I sort of want to go into here. One is the fact that, I mean, you have an oral history in your family, but as I think your family even has a saying, when the lions have historians, then we'll get a true history of the hunt or something like that. I mean, it feels like in order to because people did not keep records of slaves.
Yeah.
You know, the slaves could not tell their own narratives, and so much of history was lost.
Yes. And to build on that, what became clear to me is they didn't want to know who Rinty truly was. They wanted him to be the man they wanted him to be. And anything that I could provide that would counter that, they were dismissing that. They were squashing that. They were suppressing that. They had set the tone for what the story was, and anyone who told it differently had to go away. And that was me.
But you kept going. And what I love is your dogged research, and a lot of where you went to find research, a lot of where these little like gems of information were actually in the records of slave holders, their wills, census records. I mean, this. Can you talk about like what that was like to actually to go into that at the same time, knowing that these are people who owned your ancestors?
Yeah. And you know, I credit my temperament, and again, it's in my line of work. But in doing the research, I soon realized that in order for me to find where my enslaved ancestors landed, I had to look to the people who enslaved them and find out where they landed. And not only that, but then I had to reach out to them and talk to them. And that was difficult. When I was doing this work, I called libraries in Columbia, South Carolina. I called clerks' offices. I called universities. I called high schools. And I spoke with historians. Who are the descendants of Benjamin Franklin Taylor? I knew that he was a prominent slaveholder, very wealthy, that there must be some documented history of the family and where they went or where they lived. And I didn't really have any luck. And so ultimately what I did, and this is, and we'll probably talk about what I feel is like the divine providence of how I like to say God put information at my fingertips and important people in my path to help me tell this story. But there's so many things, miraculous things that happen that, you know, I can only describe as God's grace. But I joined this genealogy group on Facebook, and I strike up a conversation with this stranger. Her name is Rose, and we start talking, and then we start messaging, and then we start texting, so we develop a friendship. And she knew more, and she was at the time an insurance salesperson, but she knew more about the history of Columbia, South Carolina than any of the professionals, any of the scholars that I had spoken with. And she was just a wealth of information, and I said, Rose, I need to find a Taylor descendant. And she says, well, I have met with a man by the name of Dr. Edmund Taylor, who is the great-grandson of Benjamin Franklin Taylor. And then in a later conversation, I have to talk to him, Rose. And she finds his telephone number, and she gives me his telephone number. And I remember, I'll never forget, I said, Rose, are you gonna call him? She says, I'm not gonna call him, you call him. And so I just, without thinking, started dialing the number. And then as the phone was ringing, I'm thinking, what in the heck am I gonna say? and so like, and then I'm thinking, oh my gosh, you know, he's gonna answer and I don't know what to say. the phone rang and a woman answered the phone, and I said, "You don't know me. My name is Tamara Lanier, and I'm working on a family genealogy project, and I'm trying to piece my family back together, and I'm looking for descendants of Benjamin Franklin Taylor who might know where my enslaved ancestors settled." And she said, "You'd want to speak to my father. He is 98 years old and hard of hearing." I go, "No, yes." And so, but we talk, and I would say to her, and she would pass it along loudly to her father. But ultimately, I talked with Dr. Taylor, and he invited me to come to Columbia, South Carolina. And when I hung up, I went out and I said, "My girls, we're going to South Carolina to visit the family of the man who enslaved our ancestors." And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they're like, "I'm not going, you're not going." And, so they were really concerned because they knew nothing. And, the whole conversation about race is so tenuous and so, they were concerned about my safety and concerned as to who these people really were and what I was walking into. I said, "I have to go," because I knew that this was a great source of information for me. And I can honestly say that visit is something that I will take with me to my grave. I just learned so much from Dr. Taylor. He was so welcoming. He was, the entire family embraced me. Rose also visited, and he also invited another man. His name is Dr. Rudy Wise, a person who descended from the same plantation. And so it was a surreal experience. And one of the things that I took away, there were a couple of things, but I felt that Dr. Taylor wanted me to see all that the Taylor family had done to give back. And he was specific. He talked about the land that they had given back. He talked about helping people through college and different things. And it was almost where it was like, I just wanted him to relax and have a conversation. And, I wasn't there to judge him. I just needed his help in finding the information that I needed. And he wanted me to know, he said to me, that the Taylors were God-fearing people who treated their enslaved with dignity and respect. And, I irregardless of what's going on, I'm always respectful. And I remember I just felt like I needed to point out to him that there's dignity in slavery, no matter how, and I get it. What he was saying is there were Christian people, that they were good people, and they thought that they were doing this righteous thing by enslaving people, but treating them kindly. And so, I think we also had an interesting conversation when he talked about, he said that, what was unique about Benjamin Franklin Taylor, there were prominent slaveholders, and there was a collaboration between the Columbia or South Carolina slaveholders in the North, particularly the Websters and Harvard, and they all traveled to Columbia, South Carolina to visit the Taylor plantation. And Dr. Taylor was very pointed to mention to me, and he's written about this, that when Daniel Webster visited Benjamin Franklin Taylor and saw the enslaved people, that he went back and that he said on the Senate floor that he would never speak against slavery again, because he saw how kindly the slaves are treated. And so I think at that point I shared with him, I jokingly referred to it as a northern aggression, because they weren't coming to see how kind the slaves were treated. They were coming to look for a justification to promote slavery, because they were also financially embedded in slavery. And so, but we had this amazing conversation. He gave me the research that he had done in his family's genealogy. He was like my mom, the keeper of the family story, very protective of their legacy. And, we talked about things. And the one thing that stood out to me when I listened to him talk, he was telling me the same stories from the slaveholders' perspective that my mom told from Rinty's perspective. They were the same exact stories. My mom, I have her recorded saying that Rinty's descendants stole away on the Underground Railroad and escaped to Ohio. Dr. Taylor in that meeting said that the Taylor family operated an underground railroad to Ohio and sent many of their enslaved people there. My mom talked about Renty's literacy, that he would teach and read from the Bible. Dr. Taylor acknowledged that there were slaves, in his words, that would read and teach the gospel. And so I was hearing the same words, same stories, just from two very different perspectives, and it was an amazing experience.
So you accumulate all of this history. I mean, you go into census, you go into slave, I mean, it's amazing. And yet, you're still being treated as if, here you are with an anecdotal story that you can't prove. And then we start getting into the lawsuit.
Yes.
You first take to one court, but this idea that that Harvard puts forth, which is that they have the right to keep the images because the images belong to the photographer. And it's, I mean, basically arrayed against that, you have an amazing team of lawyers who help you. Can you talk a little bit about these people who you have, more angels who actually
Yes.
came into your life?
Yes, I am the benefactor of so much goodwill and grace, and this is like, I can't explain how I happened to meet Attorney Ben Crump, who I think is like the premier civil rights attorney, not only in history, in this country, but probably in the world. But I was at a conference that was packed, hundreds of people were there, and he was speaking. And it had come to me that Harvard was just stringing me along and jerking me around and not really serious about considering the concerns that I had raised to them. And not only that, there was another incident where I had started working on the book that I had promised my mom to write. It was a small genealogy book, 5 pages or so, but I wanted to put an image of Renty in it. At this point, you had to ask Harvard for permission to use it. And they literally told me no. They basically said, you need these things, which were impossible to get, like a publisher and different things at that stage. And so I'm like, okay, I'm not asking them anymore. If I want to use it, I'm just gonna use it, and if they don't like it, then they can sue me. But I was at an event, and Attorney Crump was speaking, and I saw in him someone who wasn't afraid to challenge a powerful institution like Harvard, or a corporation like Harvard. And I'm in a large audience with hundreds of people, and so I had an image of Renty on my business card, and I knew I had to make my way through that crowd, and I'm shoulder to shoulder, parting my way through. And I finally do make it to the stage and get to him, and I asked to take a selfie. And while we're fumbling over the camera, I pull out my card with Renty's image on it, and I said, this is my enslaved ancestor, and I'm in this battle with Harvard over his cultural property, and Harvard is refusing to talk to me and refusing to tell his true story. And I'm talking as quickly as I can, and he said, this is very interesting. And we exchange business cards, and I go back, and I'm not really sure. He's a very pleasant person, and I just felt like he was just kindly dismissing me. But a few days later, he calls and he says, I haven't been able to think about anything else. This is an amazing story, and this is about reparations. And I'm like, yeah, it is. And he says, I'm not licensed to practice in the state of Connecticut, so I need a Connecticut attorney. And I had been talking to people, but here in the Northeast, no one's going to, challenge Harvard's authority, and they just have far-reaching influence, and nobody wants to fight with Harvard. So I'm like, okay, so that's it. I'm done. And it happens again when I talk about these divine events. Attorney Crump had a cameo role in the filming of the movie Marshall. And the movie Marshall was written by a Connecticut attorney named Michael Koskoff and his son Joshua Koskoff. And the Koskoff firm are the law firm that has recently successfully sued Alex Jones and Remington and represent the Sandy Hook family. So Ben is filming with Mike on the set, on a Hollywood set, and they're talking about this case. And so during the filming of that movie, Ben convinces Mike to come on board. And so that's when I talk about the making of a dream team, because when Mike gets on board, he brings in documentary experts and just a whole host of things that take this case to another level. And Mike was amazing. Mike died in 2019. But I remember him writing to me saying, we are going to put together a complaint that is going to rock Harvard back on its heels. And that's exactly what he did. And I have heard from law professors from Yale and other institutions that say that this lawsuit, this complaint should be taught in every law school. And it was just an amazing piece of work, and it told a larger story. I know that attorneys have also said in interviews where Mike's son Josh was being interviewed, that they've reframed how they proceed in filing these kinds of complaints, making it less legal and more about telling larger stories. And so they put together this amazing complaint. It's historic because I think I may have the dubious distinction of being the only descendant of a person of American chattel slavery that has, when you file a complaint, you have to have, what is the term escapes me, not cause, standing. I can prove I'm Renty's descendant. I have standing. These are two enslaved people renting his daughter, Delia, who have cultural property that is so valuable that it's priceless. Historically, slaves weren't permitted to own property or have property. So the case is so unique in so many ways, but this case, I think, is the first case in the history of this country that has been brought, that has survived the motion to dismiss, and that will go to a jury, to a verdict. And so there have been reparations cases or cases filed on behalf of slaves in the past, and they've all been dismissed. And so this one is the only one in the history of this country that will move forward. So it's an amazing, the complaint is amazing, the legal questions that they raised. It's like, I think one person raised it as this should be a bar question on a bar exam, you know.
I love the fact that one of the things that was their big argument was, the fact that the photo becomes the photographer, and in your book, I wasn't sure if that was your lawyer points out, well, if say a photographer takes a picture of like child pornography, are you actually going to say the photo belongs to the photographer? And it is analogous because it's not as if Renty or Delia was in a position to refuse. They were not in a position to have any dignity. I mean, the way they were posed, I mean, it's just, they could not say no. And if they could not give consent to the photo, then how can the photo be the possession of the photographer?
Exactly. You know, I don't think we can phrase it any better. That was actually Justice Kafka, I think is his name, from the Mass Supreme Judicial Court, who said, if you kidnap someone, force them to disrobe and take nude pictures of them, he said, that's pornography. You don't get to keep those images. And he said, you know, if you take a picture of a child and you force them, that's illegal. You don't get to keep the pictures. And he said, so there are exceptions on your possessory interest if it arises out of criminal activity, right? And Harvard says yes. And so I'm like, well, then we should all go home. That's you know, there is the answer. And, you know, so I left the court that day kind of cautiously optimistic. I mean, I had been, you know, the rug had been pulled out from the lower court, so I didn't know what to expect. But I'm thinking, you know, the line of questioning from the justices was not good for Harvard. So I felt pretty good. And it took them 8 months to decide, but that's when we get I call it the split decision.
Right. spoiler alert, but, so essentially, your suit has the right to proceed, but for the moment, the daguerreotypes are still in Harvard's possession.
Yeah, the court
Um,
said that Harvard can keep the daguerreotypes, but they said I can continue with my suit, and they enlarged my suit to include a claim for reckless infliction of emotional distress.
One thing that it's just a little side note, but I just find it hopeful, is that some of your greatest supporters are the descendants of that scientist. I will say scientist in quotes because some of his theories are just completely out there. But his descendants are people who sign letters of support for you.
Yes, we are like family now. I've traveled with the Agassiz descendants. Initially, I looked for them, and then I thought, why are you looking for them? I mean, Louis Agassiz had some really dark and ugly views on racism. I mean, on black people specifically. There was just this hatred, and an intense hatred. And my fear was that hate, that way of thinking, might have been passed down to his generations, to his children. So I'm like, well, why do you want to find them? You know, they're just going to hurt your feelings. And so I stopped. And then when we filed, the story was on the front page of the New York Times. And Louis Agassiz's descendant, his great-great-great-granddaughter, Marion, saw the article, and she reached out to me on social media. And I remembered when I saw that, I'm like, you know, because, you know, also when these stories are printed, particularly at that time, there were like these trolls who liked to follow these stories to chime in and say ugly, hurtful things. And like I said, you know, when my feelings get hurt, I have to put it away and, you know, go and gear back up and build back up to do this work again. So I'm like, do you want to open the door to be offended? Do you want to, you know, just, you know, but something about her reaching out in the way she did said, respond and see what she's like. And I'm so glad I did. And she told me that, you know, the family had come together after learning of the story. They knew about Agassiz's racism, but not the extent of it, and actually tried to avoid it and turn away from it. And those, because, you know, it was all about celebrating his legacy of scientific accomplishments, and so they didn't really embrace the ugly part of his legacy until my story. And they invited me to a Zoom where the family got together. I joined in. You know, it was just like every single one of them that I met has lived a life of giving back, of building people up as opposed to tearing them down. They were the complete opposite of everything that I feared they would be, and just amazing advocates for humanity. And doing the work, I mean, doing the hard work, the uncomfortable work. And we traveled together. Eli, who is the fourth generation grandson of Louis Agassiz, he lives in Berkeley, but he was in New York this summer, and he took time to come to Connecticut to spend the day with us. And you know, we're just like family, and we talk regularly, and it's what, and she said to me, what do you need us to do? And they're just down for the cause.
I know that we want to open up the questions, but just one thing that, and I know that incidentally you've been asked this by a middle school person, but it's also what I want to know, just sort of, how have you managed to persist? There's so many things that have happened to stump you over the past decade and a half. Like what kept you going?
It is the relationship that I have with my mom, or that I had with my mother. My mom and I were probably closer than a mother and daughter should be. We spent so much time together. There wasn't a moment that she didn't call me and say, are you up? And there wasn't an evening where she didn't say, are you heading to bed now? And we were just so close. And, you know, my mother was this loving, generous, giving person who would give you the shirt off her back. the sweetest person that you'd ever want to know. And my mother, there were no broken promises between us. There was nothing that I said I would do that I didn't follow through with. And there was nothing that she said she would do that she didn't follow through with. And so when I hear Harvard say, I can never prove it, or I can never prove that their rentee is my rentee, they've actually said those crazy things. It's a slap in the face to me, but more specifically to my mother. And so when every time I feel like there's a setback or I'm not doing enough, I'm inspired by her. I have an image of Papa Renti that I look at that talks to me. I have an image of my mother, and every time I walk I see it. It's in the back of my hallway, and it's like she motivates me, she inspires me, and she keeps me going. And every January, she died on January 8th. And there were Januaries that would roll around that I would be depressed because I was feeling like I had disappointed her, that I haven't worked hard enough. And this January is the first January that I can say I really felt like it was celebratory because the book was soon to be published. Harvard, every article, every headline about them was something beating them up about something wrong they've done. It's just like they have really, like, all of these self-inflicted wounds, but I really felt this January like I had really met the promise of writing this story down and telling it. And it started out as just a small thing, but it has turned into this great American epic. And I just felt like she's proud of me. And but I had Januaries where I would cry from disappointment. But she's been my motivation. She always has been, she always will be. And, and in the end of the book, what I talk about is when this book is published, I am going to give her a copy. I have my kids call it a shrine, but I just have her picture and some of her things. And she has a book in my home, and she has a book at her graveside. And so I just feel like it's come full circle and that I've kept my promise.
That she's proud of you. I'm just thinking, is questions?
Yeah, I can go around with the mic. If anyone has questions.
Actually,
I can take this one. Okay.
I mean, it's small enough. You can have it. I have a question. Are the ages of Renty and Delia known when the photos were taken?
Yes, not exact ages. I know that Delia was born on or about like 1835. I know that, just from my own experience in working as a probation officer and looking at pornography and prepubescent breasts, and I know that Delia was a teenager. I know that there's a document that I call a little boy Renty document that puts Renty at 14 in 1800, and Renty was between 60 and 65. But the census information and the unique thing about Renty in his African origin is during that time in the 1850, if you look at census information, there are very few African-born people in the United States at this time. They're all American-born. The majority of the enslaved people at this point. So there are very few people born in Africa, and even fewer named Renty. And so, but through the documents, I can kind of get close. I don't have any, and this is the other thing that I talk about in the book is the failure to document the birth of enslaved people and the death of enslaved people was like an erasure of culture and invisibility, as if they didn't exist. And really, even when I talk about the slave cemeteries that I visited, there's no markers. They're just plants, yucca plants, that are placed as markers over them. Just, again, devaluing Black life and the life of the enslaved people. And so my mother, who was born in a small rural county in Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama, she was born without a birth certificate. My mother didn't get a birth certificate until the late 70s. And so, but my mother is a part of that culture of the failure to document, to disenfranchise Black life and to make them invisible. as if they didn't exist. So, and that's, when we like to think about these things as something happening a long time ago, but I'm just one generation removed from a person who who lived with an enslaved person. And my mother grew up in the Jim Crow South, and was exposed to this failure to document and recognize Black life and Black culture.
Several years ago, I was in a class where I gave a presentation about your film, Free Renty, so I wanted you to advertise that in case people haven't seen it, but that's where I first learned the story, but I was also able to see the pictures and talk about the story, and I volunteered to do this presentation because I was interested, actually because I knew about Louis Agassiz as a scientist, so that changed my whole perspective on him pretty quickly. And he was also one of the last holdouts against Darwin, who's, who said we're all equal and so on. And he said, no, we're not. And the whole business of Harvard holding on to this, what they call their property, I think in a way it's like a can of worms, because if they admit that you own, that you have the rights to these pictures, which you have because that's your relative, not theirs, then they have to give away everything else they stole from everywhere else in the world. And I think that's, that's a big part of the story too, of why in your film, which I thought was great, the lawyers are so different because they're all on little technicalities that have nothing to do with real life or what you're arguing for, which is, this is your relative. And this whole business of who owns the picture of the person who is photographed. But the other thing that you didn't mention tonight, but I would like you to say a little bit about, is the pictures. Agassiz's trying to get his daguerreotypist, or whatever you call a guy, to show inferiority of the slaves he took pictures of, but they all are so dignified looking that their faces, you said you knew who this guy was as soon as you saw him, you knew. And that is such a great part of your story of how it was the complete opposite image of the people and what Harvard's story was, because I guess they did a show, right? They did a show, and I think that's what I saw the pictures in, and they're saying, this proves, no it doesn't. It doesn't prove eugenics, it doesn't prove inferiority. So could you talk a little bit about just how amazing their faces were? And,
The images, I've always been troubled by Delia's tear, and there was an author, Molly Rogers, who writes about Delia's tear, because she actually, a tear wells up in her eye and it's captured in the daguerreotypes. And I often think about the trauma associated with that. And, they all have a look of resilience, survival, defiance, but there's something uniquely sad about Delia's expression that I think, and they're all telling a story in their own way by their expressions, and clearly in defiance of what is happening to them. And then there is the nudity piece, which I think the sexual exploitation, and I think that this was intentional. I think that they wanted to have the viewer focus their eye on the genitalia to say, this is so starkly different, it's unhuman, it's not like us, it's different. And so there was motivation behind all of this, but I think, I talk about, being powerless in this situation, because the enslaved people could not resist. They could not say, I'm not doing it, I'm not taking my clothes off. And so their only way of defying or resisting what was happening was the messaging that was going on in their faces. And I just think it's so profound, because each one of them, when you look at the daguerreotypes, they're clearly messaging that I am not who they want me to appear to be. And the other question that's been raised about the daguerreotypes, and specifically the nudity and the showing of it, and this is something that I hear often and I've wrestled with often, is, by showing by my showing, am I further exploiting these people, further harming them? And that's a valid point, because I do feel that way. And I often say, if I'm Delia, even if it's 200 years later, 200 years, and I've been dead for 200 years, I still don't want my naked breast on the internet for the whole world to see. But how I qualify the decision to share is, I invoke the name of Emmett Till's mother, Mamie. That you know, I know that Mamie Till, when she decided to open the casket and let that photo be taken, she knew that that was an image that would be seared in her brain for the rest of her life. And she knew the pain and the exploitation of how that would be shared. But she saw the greater good in seeing the harm caused by the inhumanity and Jim Crow and racism and what that did to her son. And I think the visual of that sent a clear message of the ugliness of racism and what was going on in the Jim Crow South. And so I like to think that by showing this, I'm choosing the greater good, to say that in order for people to know and understand the harm caused by slavery, they have to see it. And it's all of its ugliness and rawness. And if we don't see it, they'll never understand the impact that it has on people like me.
Can I ask how long your goals were when you went to South Carolina?
I think Megan might have been, she might have been in college. My oldest may have been like 24 or 26, and my youngest might have been like 18 or 19. They refused. They didn't want to go. They weren't, they tried to talk me out. They wanted no part in it, and they didn't want me to go. But I'm so happy that I went. Like I said, it was a memorable experience. Dr. Edmund Taylor took me to where the Taylor plantation home was. Again, he toured me. We toured around Columbia. He showed me where, you know, the land that they had given to the state. He told me, he said that the Taylors donated so much land to the state of South Carolina. That is the reason why Charleston, the capital, was changed from Charleston to Columbia. I don't know how true that was, but that's what he told me. But yeah, just so much to, you know, Colonel Thomas Taylor, his father, Benjamin Franklin Taylor's home. You know, I got to see and experience these places, and it was just surreal. It was just surreal. And there's something, like I said, that's different about visiting slave dwellings versus visiting them and knowing your ancestors lived there. It's just like, can't describe it. It's kind of surreal. Yes.
Have any of the descendants of the other people that Agassiz photographed, any of them emerged?
Harvard is working on, well, a Harvard fellow, the same person who worked on the book with the Peabody, is going to be publishing a book where he has discovered descendants of Jim, another man who was photoed in the daguerreotypes. I'm just reserving judgment. I'd like to read it, and then, because again, I love the fact that when scholars say, you know, this is what happened, that we all just assume that that's the case and believe it. But you just have to drill down and do your own work. And what I've learned is, you know, to be less trusting of scholarly work, because there's always some motivation behind it. And I say do your own research. But I have encountered people who I have found in the Taylor slave index that descended from Benjamin Franklin Taylor's plantation. I've talked to a few of those. The one thing that's unique about Jack and his daughter, you know, Harvard has called her Drana, but I believe it's Diana. The R is not an R, it's an I. But what's unique about that, in Colonel Thomas Taylor's slave index, Jack is in the same family grouping with my great-great-great-grandmother, I have 5 generations, I don't know if I mentioned this, 5 generations of men named Renty in my family, straight, from the man in the image to my mother. Everybody in that generation, there's one child named Renty. And so, Jack is in the same family grouping with a woman named Tina. And it's spelled T-E-N-A, not T-I-N-A. But Tina was my great-great-great-grandmother. And so that they're, since, her allegation, the same family grouping. I'm claiming now that Tina and Jack are in the same family group, they change their opinion on that, but I believe that I can make an argument that I'm related to 4 other people in the images. And the indexes, the slave indexes, were so revealing because I had my ancestors had unique names like Renty, and the spelling Tina, Fed. There's so much, and they're all grouped together in these families, and you see them all there. And so that was compelling to me. But when I did the work, the one thing that I call it putting it in my cart, like when you're doing the research and you find something that looks like a match, you hold on to it, but when you're certain, you put it in your cart, like I'm owning this one. But there were several times, like there, I've lost my train of thought now, but there was, in the census information, they link not only Tina and Jack, but Delia is related to, in this information that I found, Delia has a son that she names Renty. And this Renty somehow ended up in Charleston, South Carolina. But also, I learned that my third, Renty number 3, there are 5, I call them 1, 2, 3. Renty number 3, which is my great-grandfather, he ends up in Charleston, South Carolina too. But when I continue reading and researching, I find that both of them are owned by Benjamin Franklin Taylor's daughter, Annie W. Masique. And so I wasn't sure if this was the right Delia, but when I find she has a son named Renty, and I find that they're all owned by Benjamin Franklin Taylor's daughter, then I'm putting that in my cart and claiming it. And so those are the kinds of things, and like I just happened to be up one night scrolling and I found this book that was entitled Renty's Bell. And so I read it and I said, this sounds like my oral history. So I ordered it. And so when I'm reading it, there's Delia, I'm like, oh wow, that's interesting. I keep reading. She has a son named Renty. Oh wow, we're really getting close here. And I keep reading. By the end of the book, I learned that Renty is owned by Annie W. Masique, so that goes in the cart. And there's so many incidents like that. And it's like, genealogy it's hard because it's not an exact science, like you don't have smoking guns, but it's just the totality of things. And it's also like, there were often documents that I found that I didn't put in the cart because it didn't seem to fit. And then later when I learned more, I go back, like the the little boy Renty document, I didn't originally put in my cart. And then when I learned that Renty, his father in this document was Hector and his mother's Rose. When I get Colonel Thomas Taylor's will and his probate and his slave indexes in this family grouping is Renty, Hector, Caesar, the same names that are there. And so, okay, I'm getting ready to put it in my cart. And it's just like all of these other things that, you just have to be mindful of what you've read, and then when you read something else that sounds familiar, you got to go back and revisit it, and then you find it's a perfect fit to the puzzle. So it's like really complicated puzzle work.
I think we have to wrap up, though I do have to ask one question that I think has a quick answer, maybe not. Where are we with the lawsuit?
Well, there's this confidentiality document.
That's what I kind of figured, so I think
Yes.
it might be a quick answer, but I had to ask.
Yes, we're plugging along, and I can say this, we're moving forward and the attorneys are talking.
Nice short answer.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.